They called him Two Pines, not because he lived between two trees, but because he stood like them, steady, rooted, quiet. In a village where younger hunters sharpened steel and carried matches in store-bought tins, Two Pines still wrapped sinew around bone handles and chipped his own flint by the light of pine sap. He was old even when Cold Branch was young, and Cold Branch had been hunting since he could walk. The old man's hands were calloused in a way that steel couldn't smooth. They carried stories: a cut from a buffalo hide, a burn from dried pitch, a thumb bent at the joint from years shaping bone into blades that never cracked in the cold. He didn't argue with those who brought steel. He simply offered a nod, and sometimes a blade wrapped in hide with no price. Most took the steel anyway. It was faster, shinier, promised by catalogs and radio ads to never fail. But in the deep winters, the steel did fail. It snapped when the cold bit deep. It dulled when cutting sinew or bark. It couldn't be sharpened without tools the snow swallowed whole. Two Pines just kept carving. His knives were not weapons, they were companions. Each had a different curve, a different lash, a different balance. Some had a hollowed grip lined with softened bark for warm fingers. Others were wide and flat, made for scraping hides or splitting roots without cutting through them, and each was tied, not forged. Once a young hunter laughed as Two Pines tested a blade against the edge of a frozen deer hide. "You still waste time on that bone craft?" he asked, holding out a gleaming folding knife. "This cuts faster." Two Pines nodded. "Fast cuts meat, slow saves hands." The young man didn't understand. He would, but not yet. When storms came, and tents collapsed, and gear froze in place, Two Pines' tools still worked. They flexed instead of snapped. They warmed instead of chilled. They whispered instead of shouted. And Cold Branch watched. As a boy, he sat by the old man's side, passing bark strips, fetching deer gut, holding the blades up to the light. He didn't always understand why the tools were made this way, why bone was chosen over steel, why certain angles mattered, why the knife was tied like a bow and not nailed like a trap. But he remembered how they felt in his hand, and that would matter later. Because in a world rushing toward modern, the old man wasn't trying to keep up. He was preparing for when everything else fell behind. The last blade Two Pines ever made didn't look like much. Its handle was carved from elk bone, curved not for show but for grip, with a hollow thumb notch shaped by instinct, not measurement. The blade itself was stone, not sharp like steel, but honed with purpose. It had a dull belly for scraping and a narrow tip for piercing. The spine was flat, polished smooth to strike against flint or dry bark. Wrapped around it all was a layer of softened birch bark, then deer sinew, tied in a spiral so tight it sang when the wind passed through it. Cold Branch watched it come to life. He was 17 that winter, already hunting solo, already carrying a steel knife he'd traded pelts to buy. But when his grandfather handed him the finished blade, Cold Branch held it like it was breathing. "What's it for?" he asked. Two Pines ran a finger along the sinew wrap. "For when the things they sell you stop working." "But it's stone," Cold Branch said, unsure. "Why not use the steel you made last year?" Two Pines shook his head. "Steel remembers fire, bone remembers the body, and stone remembers the land. This knife gives, yours breaks." He didn't mean it as insult, he meant it as memory. Cold Branch used it for a while. To clean hides, to split bark, to shave pine kindling for the stove, and he found it worked not faster, but truer. It didn't bite when it wasn't supposed to. It flexed slightly when pressure came. And it never slipped from his hand, even in snow. But then Two Pines died. The village wrapped him in fur and laid him into the earth before the ground froze solid. Cold Branch placed the knife at his grandfather's feet, but the old aunties took it and handed it back. "Tools must walk," they said, "not sleep." Still, Cold Branch didn't use it much after that. Life was different now. The world was louder. There were machines in the towns, stores with knives in plastic packs. He moved south for a while, worked odd jobs, learned how to use a lighter instead of flint. The old knife stayed behind, wrapped in hide, stored in a cedar box his grandfather had carved from a storm-fallen branch. Years passed, seasons changed, New gear came and went. Cold Branch kept a multi-tool in his backpack now, something with pliers and a flashlight and a tiny saw that always seemed to stick. But sometimes, when the air turned sharp and the trees leaned like they remembered something he didn't, he'd find himself unwrapping that bundle, running his thumb over the bark wrap, and remembering how it never failed. The snow started falling faster than the forecast had promised. The hikers were only 3 miles from the ranger cabin. They thought they could make it before sundown. Then the trail vanished. What had been a clear path hours earlier was now a blank page, wind-scrawled and cruel. The GPS blinked red, then black. The satellite phone wouldn't connect. Their emergency blankets tore in the wind like paper. One man's boots began leaking. Another's steel blade shattered while trying to strike a frozen branch. Cold Branch didn't panic. He had been quiet all day, walking at the back of the group. They had invited him along because he knew the woods, not because they believed they'd need him. Now, huddled behind a rock wall, wrapped in plastic that was beginning to freeze and crack, they looked to him. He didn't reach for the multi-tool. He pulled the cedar-wrapped bundle from the bottom of his pack, the same bundle he hadn't touched since fall. He unwrapped it like something sacred. The bone handle glowed faintly in the low light. The bark grip still smelled of pine. "What is that?" one of them asked. Cold Branch didn't answer. He struck the back of the blade against a shard of flint he'd kept in his pocket. Sparks flew, caught on dry moss tucked inside his coat. He blew gently, fed it with cedar twigs. Within minutes, smoke curled upward, not from a lighter, not from a match, but from memory. Then he started cutting. Willow branches for a snow trench. Birch bark for insulation. He scored grooves without snapping wood. He used the spine to press knots. The knife flexed in the cold. It did not crack. It worked slowly, but it worked reliably. As the night dragged on, the others huddled inside the snow shelter he'd shaped, breathing air warmed by coals and dry bark. One man tried his stainless knife again. It slipped from numb fingers and vanished into the powder. Cold Branch handed him a sliver of bone, sharpened into a wedge. "Use this." The man took it and said nothing, just nodded. By morning, the storm had passed. The trail reappeared. The cabin was reachable again. The rescue team that met them later heard how the fire stayed lit, how the shelter didn't collapse. How, when gear froze and batteries died, one blade never failed. They asked Cold Branch about it. "Some old design," he said, "from a long time ago." But he knew. That knife wasn't old. It was right. When spring thawed the trails and the last of the snowmelt trickled down the mountain, word of the story began to travel. It started with the ranger at the cabin, who'd heard about the old knife that lit a fire in a blizzard. Then came a survivalist blog post written by one of the hikers, a former Army medic who claimed that modern gear had nearly failed him, but a bone-handled blade, carved by an old tribal man, had saved them all. The post went viral in the fringe corners of the internet. Then came the phone calls. A museum offered money 4 figures, then 5 for Cold Branch to send them the knife, or at least the design. A historically significant artifact of indigenous engineering, they said. We'd preserve it in a glass case, tell its story. Cold Branch declined. He didn't want it behind glass. Instead, he went home. Back to the same village where 2 pines had carved tools on an old flat cedar stump. The stump was still there, though it had weathered into a dark stone gray, its cracks filled with moss. Cold Branch cleared it with a pine bough, sat down, and unwrapped the knife once more. This time, he didn't just hold it. He began again. Bone, bark, sinew, flint. Not in imitation, but in continuation. His hands remembered even what his mind had forgotten. The angle of the binding, the way the twine must overlap just so, to flex instead of snap. The way the handle must press into the palm, not too hard, not too smooth. A neighbor saw. Then another. Within weeks, 3 young men came asking how to make their own. Not just hunters, tradesmen, trail workers, a young woman who had once studied engineering and returned home to learn something truer. They didn't want a copy. They wanted understanding. So Cold Branch taught them, not just the materials, but the mindset, the silence behind the design. why a blade should bend, why a handle should breathe. Why survival isn't about the sharpest edge, but the one that remembers its place in the world. No advertisements, no logos, no upgrades, just wisdom, shaped by need, passed down without fanfare. And still, the museum kept calling. Each time, Cold Branch would smile and say, "It already lives where it belongs." Not in a case, but in calloused hands, on cold nights, in moments where silence means danger and warmth means memory. Because some tools aren't meant to be preserved. They're meant to be used again and again. Now, the blade passes from hand to hand without leaving. Not the same knife that one stays with Cold Branch, tucked in a cedar wrap, resting above his fire pit when not in use. But the design, the spirit of it, lives in many places. Hunters carry versions of it on snow trails. Foragers use it to peel bark and score roots. Children learn to shape bone not just as a craft, but as a conversation with time. And when the wind howls through the trees the way it did that night on the mountain, someone always reaches for it, never wondering if it'll hold, because it does. Always. No one remembers the day it was first made. Not exactly. Two Pines never marked the date. He didn't call it an invention. He didn't name it. He didn't write it down. But the blade spoke anyway in how it bent when it needed to, how it sparked when asked, how it warmed fingers through the cold, not because of what it was made from, but because of why it was made at all. And the world began to notice again. A man from the city came once wearing a nylon coat and carbon fiber boots. He brought a folding knife with a flashlight in the handle, boasting 30 tools in one. He'd read the blog, asked to see the original. Cold Branch handed him a replica, not because he was hiding the real one, but because they were all real now. The man turned it in his hands, puzzled. No edge guard, no numbers, no grip texture. Cold Branch only nodded, but it cuts, and it listens. The man didn't understand. That was fine. Not everyone is meant to. You can't mass-produce a spirit. Some things don't scale. They endure. The blade wasn't designed to compete. It was made to last. Not just through cold, or hunger, or storm, but through forgetting. Through the centuries when bone was replaced with plastic, sinew with glue, and fire with batteries. It waited. Quietly. Until the world remembered that sometimes, when nothing else works, old things still do. And so it lives. Not in museum glass, not in online catalogs, but in the way one person teaches another, in the way hands move without speaking, in the way a blade feels warm even before the fire starts, because some tools are more than tools, they are memory, sharpened, and survival doesn't come from the newest edge, it comes from the one that remembers you when everything else forgets.